please just stop. Stop me at any time, and you're not. You can eat like anything you need to do. I'm not going to be offended. Um, I wanted to. I have a little bit of a presentation, but um, I hope this is it. Oh yeah, okay. Um, just to help guide me a little bit, just so that I'm not going all off the rails here. Um, so I'm gonna, as Tara said, I'm gonna really talk a little bit about some of the promotional efforts. I'm gonna say right up front that, I do have a background in communications and marketing professionally, but I'm not an expert. I did work in book publishing and publicity for early part of my career, but I'm just like everyone else, who's just sort of trying to figure it out. So anyway, um, let me start by saying for me, the first thing that I did when I thought about my book, even before I started writing, was who is the audience? And this is the sort of thing that I would do with any kind of marketing or promotional work that I'm doing. You really need to think about the audience. Um, in my case in particular, and I really try to avoid saying this because it sounds ridiculous in some ways, but the idea for my book really came to me almost like immediately. It just really hit me when I was walking in Salem. Um, and I was compelled to write a short story, which I wrote in a couple of days that was really based off of this, that became essentially became the novel. So I knew even after I wrote the short story that I probably wanted to expand it into a novel. And it was really at that point, that early in the process, where I started to think, who would read this, right? Like, who would care? Um, and so for me, with this Venn diagram, I mean, what I was really trying to get at is the core audience. Obviously there hopefully are people outside of this, but really thinking about, okay, I know there are people who are very interested in the Salem witch trials. I know that now even more, but there are many, many people who have a very, very strong interest in this topic. So I know those people are going to be part of it. However, a lot of those people are really focused on the actual story. And while my book does recount much of the actual story, because it's doing it through the eyes of two of the most prolific accusers, and I'm making up their dialogue and all that. That's why it's historical fiction. I like to think that I tried to give something to those people who, are interested, because what I was trying to do is sort of illustrate how this could happen. Sort of answer some of the unknowable questions. So I still knew the people who were interested in the Salem witch trials might be interested in this book. And then, of course, there's that group of people who are really interested in historical fiction, which, I really wasn't aware of how many there are, but there's quite a few. So for me, the real core audience is that connection of that group. Um, but then the other component to this, and this is where my experience in publishing previously helped me, is I understand the challenging landscape that we're in. You could be published by a big five publisher and you're still dealing with these same issues. And it's actually a lot worse because those authors are really pissed off about it. But what the issues that I sort of knew would be the case for someone like me as a new author, no name, first time author, even if I were published by a large publisher, but knowing that I wouldn't be most likely, is you're going to have very limited brick and mortar book distribution. You're not going to walk into Barnes and Noble and see it stacked up on the tables. In fact, you're most likely not going to walk into any bookstore and see your book in any kind of quantity. But you know what? That's okay. But I think it's important to understand that that's the case. And so that was something that I thought about, um, and had to reckon with, right? Like it's something you have to understand. The other is very obvious, is that readers are not just going to automatically discover your book. There are, if you take it, even if you take out self-published books, there are hundreds of thousands of new books published every year. And 99.99% of them you've never heard of and never will hear of, even if you are in the book world. So, like, again, and I know I promise I'll be more up, I'll sound better as we move forward. But, like, these are important things to keep in mind because from my experience working with authors, a couple of decades ago, this is where they get upset, right? Like this is where they start saying, wait a minute, I didn't, what do you mean people don't, aren't clamoring to get my book about, 14th century pottery? Why is that not on the, like I would deal with those kinds of things because a lot of times they didn't understand the realities. But this is where we start getting into the better stuff. One of the things that is really remarkable is, say what you will about Amazon and whatever, but like the fact that you can go and like order, my book or Everett's book, you can go, you book, it's readily available. And so you have an opportunity to really use that to so that you can reach that core audience because sure they may not be able to go and walk into a bookstore, but they can get the Kindle version immediately, so there's a really good opportunity there. So then I'm thinking about the audience, that core audience. So how do I engage them? So a little bit more bad news before I go into the good news. I knew that like the traditional, well, like when we think about, oh, book attention, we're often thinking about where do I get reviews? Can I be on NPR? Like that kind of thing. I knew that would not happen for me. I knew the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, none of those places are going to review my book. It's fine. Their mandate is a little bit different. Obviously they're covering the large commercial books, they're covering books that are in the news cycle, things like that. So then you say, well, okay, what do I do instead? Right? Like what are the options? One of the challenges that I have is because I live in Los Angeles, I don't really have local media. It's all, the LA Times is not local. They're not covering local authors, that sort of thing. So that is one outlet, obviously, that people can go down. But I started to think about, okay, what's a big thing I can do? And, this isn't going to be for everyone, but I started a podcast. So for me, and what I will say about this is it doesn't have to be a podcast. It could be a blog. It could be that you get super active on social media. Better just with TikTok, you better hurry up before it gets banned. But a lot of folks, for example, are doing that, and with great success. But for me, and I want to be clear, like I started the podcast to help build the audience, but I also really did genuinely have a passion and an interest. When I was done writing, I wasn't finished telling this story. And I have experience doing podcasts, producing a couple of other podcasts for clients of mine. And I realized that a podcast really suits the Salem witch trials is really well suited for a podcast because it is one of those topics that, almost everyone has heard of, but almost no one knows anything about. There's a huge discrepancy. So people, and this happens too, In October, the listens are like through the roof because people are like, oh, I'm interested in the Salem witch trials. And of course, no surprise that they've fallen off a bit now, but like it's, people see it and they think, oh, I want to know more about that. So I knew a podcast was a good vehicle. So about 11 months before publication, I launched this podcast um, and put out 2 episodes a month. That was pretty extraordinary in terms of building the audience. So I'll get into that a little bit more later. But some other things that I did is I really engaged with Goodreads and Facebook groups to try to understand who the readers are. Who are those people who read historical fiction, and not just read historical fiction, but are obsessed with it. Many of those readers I learned are mood readers or people who, come September or October really want to read something spooky, right? So that's when they start thinking about books like my book. I won't lie that it sometimes became frustrating because my book is new that it wasn't sort of on people's minds. Like there were a number of times. There's one group in a Facebook group that literally has, I don't know, like 150,000 members. Very active, really good group. People go on all the time and say, I'm going to New England and it's September and I want to read something about the Salem witch trials. And they don't allow self-promotion, which is actually what makes the group work so well. If they allowed self-promotion, it'd be terrible. So like I have to sit there and be like, I have like a really great, this is a really great book for you to read. And then, people would mention, dozens and dozens of other books. I did get a friend of mine to post a couple of things, a couple of recommendations. But like my point is one of the frustrations that you'll have in engaging this way is you don't always, you'll see that, like to my earlier point, people don't just automatically know about your book. But I found it really fruitful to be able to engage with people this way because, or at least to observe them, because it was just helpful to see what they were talking about, what they were interested in, why they were interested in it, and that sort of thing. The other thing that I did, and this probably less than I should have, but something I'd highly recommend, is find your social media and engage with it. The only recommendation I would have is to give more than you take. And what I mean by that is, social media is littered with people who just want to talk about themselves and promote themselves. I mean, that's the thing. But if you are actually someone who is helping people, you're engaging with them, you're asking questions, that often is very different and something that they like. By the way, this is Wink. He showed up. He wanted to say hi. So that's something I did a little bit, but I will admit that I have not done to the extent that I should. Part of it's a give and take because you're doing a podcast. You have to pick a lane, right? So anyway, other things that, again, any author can do, and many authors do, is launch a blog. I have a blog on my website. I do not write that much on it. Again, there's a lot of upside there, a lot more I could have done. But what is great about it is you're producing content that you can then use on social media to engage with the very people that you're trying to engage with. So it helps build credibility and it helps remind them who you are and why they might be interested in what you have to say. So that's a lot easier than doing a podcast, but it's something, we're all writers, it's something we can all focus on. This is an important component as well. My podcast enabled me, because I had a pretty good audience, it enabled me to push those people, to sort of direct those people, put out messages about the book before it came out, and people could sign up to be on the mailing list. That mailing list has grown to over 3,000 people at this point. So that gives me the opportunity every month or so to put out a message to them. Um, Again, it reminds, these are people who self-selected, they definitely are interested in the book. Doesn't mean they're all going to buy the book, of course. But it also provided us an opportunity to do an early promotion, which I think went really well. And as an opportunity to give those people something for signing up, but then also build a little bit of buzz for the book as well. So I just want to circle back to the podcasting issue. Like I said, this was used for me to establish credibility and connect with the audience. So, people could be like, oh, that's the podcast guy, that's his book. And then, a lot of those people who are listening to the podcast are people who will be interested in the book. And, I would promote the book on the podcast and that sort of thing. And, undoubtedly that's led to sales. So, obviously it all is very simple in that regard. It did allow me, because I started at 11 months, almost a year prior, to really build that pre-publication audience. Now, again, replace podcasts with blog or social media presence. You could do those things as well. What I would suggest is you start early and you engage very seriously. Again, this is a time investment, but I think it was highly effective. I'm still doing the podcast. I plan to still do it for at least, probably at least 6 more months. I mean, I do think there's a point where, I'm up to 29 episodes. I think there's a point where people are like, I'm not going to listen to more than 40 episodes about this topic. But there is so much to unpack and talk about that I could probably do, 100 episodes pretty easily. So another thing that I engaged in that I think was really fruitful is, again, New York Times Book Review might not be reviewing my book, but people on Instagram and TikTok could be. And so that's really what I thought about. So those of you may know about this, but there's a whole section of Instagram that they call Bookstagram, and TikTok called Book Talk. And these are people, influencers, I'll use quotes there too, who are interested in books. It's actually really heartening. You see these people on TikTok who are really legitimately passionate about a lot of books. And so I sort of delved into this world to try to understand who these people were. And there are quite a few who are, falling within that core audience for me, and would be for you as well. So I did a lot of research. When I say a lot, I mean I just put in a little bit of time every day scrolling through like TikTok and Instagram. I kept a spreadsheet of people who I found. And then, some people on Instagram and TikTok have like an email where they'll say, reach out this way. Sometimes I would just do direct messages to them. But I had a certain number of, my author copies and certain copies that I had that I was willing to part with. And I would reach out to people who I felt would be interested. And quite often they would get back to me super excited and say, I'd love to get your book and potentially talk about it and review it. So I would send them a book. And this is the beauty of the time we live in, because it's sometimes they would review the book, but a lot of times it's like the unboxing of the, they get it and they open it up and they talk about how excited they are and what the book is. And they're like, look at this. And, and then maybe they do another post about, I'm 2/3 of the way through and it's really great. And, and then maybe at the end they actually review it. And then often what they'll do is they'll say in October I read 6 books and one of them was the Putnams
I
of
thought he was
Salem.
going to talk about the witches.
I can also do that if you would like. Um, so anyway, so I lost my place there. Anyway, there's that aspect, and I started doing a lot of that stuff. So I would also reach out. I would also connect with reviewers on Goodreads as well. So Goodreads is a really rich place to find readers, find people, other authors. People are very interested in all things books. So one thing I will say is there are a lot of people who still have book blogs, and I did a lot of outreach to those folks as well and found it to be much less fruitful. So that was, and I don't know if that's moving, people are moving away from book blogs and moving more toward Instagram and TikTok, but I'm finding Instagram and TikTok to be much more fruitful. Um, the key here was to do a personalized, sort of succinct pitch to them with a hook. For me, it was, I did all of this in mostly late September and October. So it was really like, hey, it's spooky season. Here's a book for you. Many people were very excited to hear from me. Many people, you know, there are lots of people who won't respond, but this was, the way in which I reached out, and I tried to really be thoughtful about who I reached out to. So for me, most of the people who were responsive tended to be not the people who had the most followers. Those tend to be, work a lot with the major publishing houses. And they get a lot of outreach, and they're just like the New York Times. They're going to ignore a lot of smaller uh, smaller authors. So a lot of the mid-tier and up and coming reviewers were the influencers, were the people I reached out to, and that was generally um, successful. And then being personalized, like really saying, hey, I saw you wrote, or not wrote, I saw you post something about a similar book, or it seems like this is something you might like. And then occasionally you have to follow up. And when I did that, it often worked. I'd send a book, they wouldn't post anything, for a long time, and I might follow up and say, hey, just want to check in, still plan on reviewing this. Not saying like, you better review it, I sent you the book. More like, hey, is this still of interest? And usually they're going to be like, oh, yeah, just, I've been busy or whatever. So that was pretty important. Um, so the realities. So a lot of pitches are going to be ignored. It's just natural. People are going to not be interested. It's par for the course. Some reviewers will not follow through. Some of them will say, "Sure, send it to me. I'm super excited. I love this topic so much, and I eat, sleep, and drink it." And then nothing happens, But that's just this is life. We're human beings, right? So it is what it is, and you can't get too discouraged. For me, I got dozens of reviews and mentions. So I mentioned Goodreads because a lot of these folks are also on Goodreads. So they'll go on Goodreads and rate or review your book there as well. But, as I mentioned earlier, you'll often get not just a review, but you'll get a mention that you sent them the book, an unboxing of it, and they show you, those kinds of things. And often, at the end of each month, these folks like to recap what they've done, so you maybe get another mention. So again, that provides you an opportunity to take that content and repost it, share it with your folks as well. So that was a particularly useful and fruitful exercise for me. And there was definitely anecdotal evidence of sales. People would comment and say, "Oh, I've got to get that book," or "I bought that book," or "Thank you for," So that was kind of nice to see. So the final sort of roundup of things, the takeaways here, I think it's super difficult for us as human beings to be objective and honest about what we do. But I think it's really, really important when you're writing a book to really understand the audience for that book. Um, I used to, when I worked in book publishing, I was a publicist, and we would often have new authors come in, and we would get to the point, and they'd be very excited, and we'd get to the point where they're talking to the promotional people, and we would say, "Who's the audience for your book?" And they would ultimately list like 20 different groups, and then say, "Really, everyone." And then you just knew it was going to end badly. So it's really important to fight that urge. It doesn't mean that what you're writing can't be universally loved, but you really need to focus on that core audience. And then, figure out how to engage with those folks. And again, you're probably not going to do it through traditional means. You're going to have to think, you know, a lot of people do it through events. I did a handful of events, but not a lot of them. Events are another great way to engage that core audience. So you really do need to just identify the core audience and then figure out how you engage with them. Um, so I alluded to this before, try different methods, build relationships. So it's not just about promotion. No one really wants to hear you talk about, here's my book, go buy it or whatever. Like they just don't. I think when you do marketing and communications, you really have to think about the audience, as I mentioned. And, the push pull there is always, but I need them to know this. And it's like, I understand that, but at the end of the day, it's about what they're receptive to hearing. And so, like, you really need to think about, you know, building your credibility and building relationships with that core audience. And that, I think, is everything I have. So that's essentially all my knowledge. But I want to have a conversation. I want to answer questions. And if you want to, if anyone wants to talk about the book, I'm happy to talk about the topic. We can talk about anything. So
things that you know, kind of researching this topic and trying to look at different ways of how do you get to know all of these different reviewers and these influencers and everything. It's a very big world, right? And
yeah,
you try to narrow down your audience. And one thing that's been suggested is kind of tapping into some of the AI that's available now, that's out there, to kind of say, "Name 50 influencers in this is such and
yeah,
such an area that have their own Instagram following or Bookstagram following, or so, and who have reviewed more than 10 books, and you can get a big list. Have
right.
you looked at any of that kind of stuff or heard anything about that as being helpful?"
Not in the manner that you're specifically suggesting, but I actually think that's a pretty good use of AI. Like stay away from writing and
Yeah.
focus on like I actually think that's a good use. You know, I would just say that you'll still have to do your due diligence. What I find, as you can imagine, the way, particularly TikTok, which they have some kind of amazing algorithm. Um, but once you start exploring these people, you'll find other ones. They will show you other ones. Like if you spend your time looking for them, they will, particularly TikTok, will show you exactly, people adjacent to those people. So it's actually not as arduous as you might think.
Hmm.
And I actually found it to be really like almost like cathartic in a way. I don't know if that exactly is the right way of putting it, but like it was, it was, I felt like I found my people in some
Uh-huh.
ways. So it was sort of like, okay, well, that's good. I'm really heartened by this person's existence and the fact that they're on here talking about this stuff. And even if they didn't respond to me or care or whatever, like I still was glad. So I actually found it to be a good exercise. And it wasn't like I spent, hours and hours a day. It was really more of the let's just do a little of this every day, take 5, 10 minutes, and just try to do it. So it was really more of the long, tail kind of thing.
Hmm.
Anyone else? Any other Lori? Yeah.
Um, so you did the podcast and you mentioned that you were doing podcasts 2 times a month. Tell me about like how much energy or did that take and gathering of like, coming, that's like writing a book by itself is like as to what kind of content are you going to have for your podcast every 2 weeks? How much prep work did you have to do for that?
I try not to think about that. um, yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I'm not going to deny it. I mean, one of the things that I did made a purposeful decision, and I think it's good for the audience too, is the episodes are short. Um, in the beginning, I think it was hard for the listener because they're like, what? There's 2 episodes and they're only 15 minutes, But now that I have like 40 episodes or 29 episodes, no one notices, right? So doing short episodes is helpful. Um, if I have a guest, and I like to have guests as much as possible, um, I've done a lot of interviewing of people professionally on my professional work too, and like I've sort of have it down to a science where I can do it pretty quickly, but also in a kind of way that is sort of conversational. So that it doesn't feel like I'm like question one, this question two. It's we're just having a conversation, but it only takes maybe 30 minutes. Um, if I'm writing the script myself, which often I do, I've written all the scripts, but like if I don't have a guest and I'm writing the entire script, it takes a little bit of time, but I work on it a little bit every day. Again, for me, that's the key. I'll work on it a little bit, put it aside. Then you go through just like writing, any writing. You're like, I can't believe I wrote that, and then you edit it, and so I sort of I've gotten it down. I mean, it's definitely several hours to do, and then the recording and editing. So it's a big undertaking, but I mean, in October, for example, I had almost 30,000 listens collectively of my episode. So, like, I'm not saying that translates into 30,000. Obviously, it doesn't. But those are people who are getting exposed. And the beauty of a podcast is, there are hundreds of listens every day, of these episodes, and so, more people are listening, more people are hearing it. Some people hate it, Some people are like, that's the stupidest podcast I've ever heard. No, no one's been that bad. People don't like that I add music, which I've a big, like, I think sound design is important. Maybe I was a little overzealous in the beginning, but I've got it down. Um, but I mean, for the most part, people are positive about it. Um, so for me, it's worth doing. And now, I sort of have a fan base or whatever. So I'm like, well, I got to keep doing it. Like I've got to see it through and do right by this podcast, and then put it to bed when it's time. So uh, it's a long way to answer your question. It is a lot of work, but I've got it down a little bit to a science, I think.
So what's next? Like, I mean, so you got the book out, you got a podcast going. But I mean, I think for anybody who's a writer, it's like, how do you keep the how do you get the momentum started, and how do you keep it going?
Yeah, that's someone tell me.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
what's your plan?
I don't know. I don't
No?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, like I said, this idea, I like writing. I plan on continuing to write. I mean, I definitely do. But, kind of going back to what I was saying originally, like you have to think about your audience. Like, I'd be curious to anyone on this call. Like, I can't imagine just sitting down and saying, what should I write? And then just tooling around. I just can't do that. Like, this was an idea that came into my head, and then I sort of felt compelled. So I don't know how to do it. I've done some writing since and sort of started and stopped and just wasn't feeling it. So I don't know. Like, I don't know if anyone can contribute to that, but I'd love to hear what people have to say.
Everett, it's coming off of mute here. I
Yes,
mean, same question to you. What's your plan? Like, what's
I'm the
Tara's laughing,
same.
but see,
I have no idea. Absolutely, there's no plan. Yeah, you think I'm much smarter than I am if you think I have a plan.
well, I
No,
didn't
no,
say that, but it's
no, I don't know. I'm the same way. I mean, you start you write what you're interested in, and you gravitate towards something else, and then you hope that there's a market and a buyer and partners that will go that way, and then you just keep moving.
But I
So
think what the thing is, I mean, and obviously I don't have an answer to this either, but I think that like you've got to like maintain an interest in the audience, and like you keep
Mhm.
putting out content and see if you can kind of like hook them, or like you putting out something that they're interested in. And I think that's difficult, but I think you're on the right track, Greg, anyhow, as far as like you put something out on a regular basis. You try and build a following. Like you go on other sites, you see what other people are doing, and you just keep pushing. That's what and I don't think it's easy. Like I think that it's, you
Well,
know,
what's interesting about Greg, the way that you presented it is, you looked for your audience, you found your audience. And I think what's amazing is I think now your audience trusts you and connected to you, and that's your little tribe. But what's really interesting is if right now you decided to write about woodworking
Brian,
or 11th century, archery, part of that tribe would go with you now because they're connected.
I hope so. I
Yeah.
hope
uh,
so.
but do you follow like, I mean, if there's a particular author that you follow, um,
Yeah,
do
I
you
mean, I
write,
think
do you read anything that they write?
I, I do that with certain well, yeah, I mean, fiction or nonfiction, but like, yeah, I mean, I definitely would do that. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that maybe some are like that, but Everett's point is, the one that gets me is, look, I got pulled into the Salem witch trials, partly because of my own family heritage and connection to it, but frankly, I didn't, as I've said before, I didn't really care about it. What really pulled me in was realizing the more I learned about it, the more I realized it was really instructive about so much about, what fear can do and what, scapegoating does. And it's so relevant to a lot of things that we deal with today. And, to me, that's what drew me to it, because it was like, this is like the ideal historic, thing. You've got all of these components. You've got these sort of outlandish Puritans who are living in Massachusetts when the rest of Puritanism is gone. It's dead by then, and they're trying to make their way, and they're having conflicts with the indigenous people, and they're having conflicts with England, and they're having conflicts with each other, and there's all this fear, and it's a scary place. And it really did pull me in. But having said that, I don't want to be doing that forever, right? Like you know, so that is a question for me: is where do I go? Where do I go? And I'm sort of waiting for the lightning to strike again, I guess.
But what I find with your book was that I found it relevant. I found it relevant. I could read your book and I could say how it pertains to me, how it pertains to the world. Isn't that something that all our writing should do? Like, how is it relevant and to what group is it relevant to? Like, like you're writing a story, but who is going to be interested? What are you saying in your story? Like, that's what I mean, that's what I think.
To build on that, one of the, thinking of, there's the what's next, what's the next book, right? But or the next project, but there's also the what's next, this next phase of this book, right? And
Right.
and I think looking at what Lori's just saying and just thinking like the relevance of it, so you've got a lot of people who are interested in the Salem witch trials, but you might also be able to kind of start bridging to people who are interested in what it's bringing out about scapegoating, about
Hmm. Hmm.
the way that we like to blame other people for our problems and
Hmm.
deflect and everything else. And there's probably a pretty big audience for that. And kind of taking that, look down that rabbit hole on book talk and things and see
Yeah.
what other audiences can be
Yeah.
built in there. And that could be a very interesting phase two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think for me, and probably for a lot of people, I don't know if I can force anything, it's just sort of like, and I hate being precious like that because that's not how I am. Normally I would force something, but this is just not something I could do. I have to really be compelled. And so for me, that's the deal. I think what would be ideal is for Netflix to call, and then that would give us something to focus on for a while, and then I could take it from there.
Could you translate your podcasts into episodes, like so that I mean, like your podcast, there's no pictures or anything. Couldn't it be translated into a series?
Well, we are going to have the audio, so the audio will kind of do that. The podcast I do, I take it very seriously in terms of, and this will sound precious, I guess, but I take the responsibility seriously. Um, you know, there is a tremendous amount of disinformation when it comes to the Salem witch trials. Everyone has their little reason why they think it happened, and it's very human nature for people to be like, well, it was because of this, it was because of that. That's what we do as humans. The reality of the fact is it was not that simple. And so the narrative thread that runs through the podcast is that. And so I hammer that point home every episode, and I actually take it pretty seriously. So, I don't want to necessarily, like, part of what I think has helped me a little bit is I try to be authentic. And with the podcast, it was like, I know that a lot of people who listen to the podcast don't have an interest in the book, would not have an interest in it, and that's fine. Um, and there are people who read the book but don't care about the podcast, and that's fine too. But I try not to force one into the other, if you know what I mean. Because I feel like the best way to win people over is by truly being authentic and trying to do your best to do right by those people. And so my goal with the podcast is to really tell this story. I also love storytelling. I love it. I love being able to, it's amazing the stories. Usually the episodes are the stories of individual people and how they connect. And these stories are insane. I mean, some of them are fairly straightforward, but some of them are just absolutely remarkable. Um, the one I recently did, the most recent episode, which came out, I think, earlier this week. I mean, it's just the things that happen, and you're just like, It's unbelievable. So to me, I don't want to take, to me, that's the secret sauce of the podcast. And I would hate to just turn it into a promotional, self-promotional thing.
Greg, how did the Salem witch trials end? Like, and what happened to those people afterwards?
So basically, what happened is they came to their senses. Basically, what happened is people started chattering about what was happening. So a lot of intellectuals in Boston and they were writing letters to people in Europe and stuff and saying, like, I can't believe what's happening. This is insane. And ultimately, the governor of Massachusetts Bay, um, who was actually from Maine, he was the first person from North America to be knighted. So he was like this hick from like Maine who had made his way to London, and he was like an explorer and became like this big guy. So then the king names him the governor of Massachusetts, and he was not about to stick his neck out for these people. And so he wanted to shut it down, and he shut it down. A lot of people will tell you another thing that happened is there were starting to be rumors that people were going to accuse his wife of being a witch, and there was some truth to that, but it was mostly just they realized it had gotten out of control, so they shut down the court. The people who were still in jail ended up, staying in jail for a while, and then they ended up pretty quickly after just letting them all go. And what's interesting about Salem is they realized really quickly after what a mistake it was, and they basically did everything they could to try to pretend like it didn't happen. So, um, it was that's another area that needs to be explored more is the aftermath. Particularly in I write about the Putnams, Thomas and his daughter Anne. And Thomas and his wife died in 1699, 7 years after, within like 2 weeks of each other. They left Anne, who was by that time 19 years old, but she was an orphan and had to take care of their 8 children. So I mean, and she never married, and she, was a very tragic figure. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on sort of what happened after.
There's your next book.
I mean, I've thought about that, but I don't know. Again, I have to, yeah, I have to really think about whether that's the direction or
Yeah,
not.
just talk about Anne and her 8 children. There's got to be a lot of stories right in that.
Yeah, but it's got to be more than that. It's got to be more than that. There's got to be the lightning. The lightning's got to be there. So, anyway, I really appreciate everyone being here, and I'm happy to stay on and talk more. So I'm not trying to shut it down, but I'm just saying that, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk, because obviously I like it.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really, really informative.
And just from an outside perspective, Greg, I mean, you've got such a great grasp of this, and what I love is there's passion, but there's no ego. I mean,
Thank you.
writers are notorious for that, and that gets wrapped around the wheels so quickly. And it's just amazing to see that your plan and the fact that you're passionate about it. And it's so rare. I mean, it's just refreshing.
Thank you. That means a lot. I appreciate that a lot.
Genuinely nice guy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, you guys are great, and I thanks for indulging me too.
Anybody have any other questions? All right, well, if you do have any other questions, feel free to email me, Tara at blindsquarebooks.com, and I can forward that on to Greg. But otherwise, thanks, Greg, for doing this. I really appreciate it. I think there's a lot of valuable stuff in there,
Absolutely.
especially for most of us are writers, so or people trying to market books. So the more information is, appreciated. So, and thank you everybody for coming. So And I'm going to post this. I recorded it, so I'm going to post this on our YouTube over the weekend. So if you missed anything, want to revisit it, you'll be able to do that. I'll post it on our social media, so you'll be able to find it pretty easily. So, well, thanks again for coming, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Bye,
Thanks, Greg.
everyone.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.